Hello everyone. The more observant among you may have noticed that thus far I have yet to produce a hardware review. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first and main reason is the difference between hardware and software. Good software starts at a fairly complete point and improves from there. However, hardware being tangible objects don't possess this capability, with the exception of some extra functionality being added via firmware updates. So for the end user, the general hope is that over a period of time a good piece of software will improve, while a good piece of hardware will stay the same. My other major issue is the timescales I see attached to many of the hardware reviews I've watched on the web. Hardware reviews generally fall into one of two categories: those who have recently bought the item, or those who have been sent the item by the manufacturer on loan for review. The problem with the former is the reviewer has recently outlaid not an inconsiderable amount of shekels on the item. They're probably still quite besotted with their new purchase and therefore more likely to suffer from confirmation bias. The problem with the latter is it creates an implicit contract between the manufacturer and reviewer. The manufacturer has made an investment in the reviewer and will wish to see a return on that investment in the form of a review. Of course, a good manufacturer will not try to influence the review and will instead let the hardware stand or fall on its own merits. However, the reviewer is still going to be under a number of pressures, and how they handle those pressures will either positively or negatively influence the review. The first pressure is going to be time. Marketing types are generally tacticians, they're not strategists, and as such they don't like to be kept waiting. The remaining pressures on the reviewer are going to be internal. They may pressure themselves not to be overly negative in case they deny themselves future opportunities. Those who play the social media game will be under pressure to get clicks and the resultant hipster welfare they shill for on Patreon. So for that kind of reviewer, being first or most dramatic will often overshadow all other considerations. Returning to more familiar territory, I prefer to look on a review like a relationship. So a software review can be compared to a successful Tinder date or one-night stand with potential, where a hardware review is more akin to a long-term relationship. Ask a lady friend about her new relationship and she'll tell you he's kind, considerate, generous, strong, handsome and hung like a donkey. Roll the clock forward 2 years, ask the same question and the response may be drastically different. She may endlessly remonstrate about what she's still doing with this lazy retarded oaf who post-coitus wipes his bell end in her pillowcase, rolls over, farts and commences snoring. With the former probably excessively long preamble in mind, we'll take a look at the Thrustmaster Warthog HOTAS. No doubt there are some of you asking what's a HOTAS. HOTAS is an acronym for hands-on, throttle and stick. The HOTAS evolved alongside the increasing complexity of post-World War II aircraft. Even if you go back to late World War II and look at the cockpit of, say, an aircraft like the FW-190, you can see a sort of proto-HOTAS developing. However, HOTAS was first pioneered as a concept by the British Aircraft Corporation for use in the English Electric Lightning in the 50s. Pilots should spend most of their time looking outside the aircraft at the surroundings, but with the increasing complexity of aircraft in the 1950s, without the development of the HOTAS, pilots were going to spend a considerable amount of time looking down and adjusting instruments. Cognizant of the huge operational losses during World War II, the last thing air forces wanted was their pilots to be heads down, then look up, and the last thought to go through their mind was to wonder how the fuck those mountain goats got into those clouds. Now you know the what and why, let's take a look at the Warthog HOTAS, its features and how it works. The Warthog HOTAS is a replica of the control system of the A10C Warthog. The main throttle section is obviously dominated by the twin throttle controls. The throttles have a push-pull system, so with a small adjustment you can set both idle and afterburner detents if you wish. Going from the bottom right of the right-hand throttle, you have a two-way momentary switch, a two-way permanent switch, a three-way brake switch with 2 being permanent and 1 being momentary, and a 4-way hat with the push button. Moving to the front of the right throttle, we have an 8-way hat and a mini stick with push button. Moving to the left throttle, there's a latch to link both throttles, a momentary push button and a 3-way permanent switch. The throttles operate on 14-bit 3D magnetic Hall effect sensors. Throttle friction may be adjusted via a knob giggity at the front. Moving from the top of the throttle base, we have 2 permanent 2-way switches, 2 3-way switches which are 2 permanent and 1 momentary, and 1 2-way switch. At the centre right of the base we have a single permanent 2-way switch, a momentary push button and a trim wheel. On the centre left of the base there's a permanent 3-position flap switch. Finally, at the rear of the base you have 2 2-way permanent switches, a momentary push button and a 3-way permanent switch. Moving on to the stick, we have a single momentary push button on the far right. On the top right we have an 8-way trim or point of view hat. On the top left there's a momentary weapon release button, and below that are two 8-way hats. On the left hand side in the thumb position there's a 4-way hat with the push button. On the front of the stick there's a metal 2-stage trigger, momentary pinky and paddle switches. Stick movement is controlled via a 16-bit magnetic Hall effect sensor. With the description out of the way, let's move on to the build while we take off. The first thing you'll notice about the Warthog is the weight. The combined weight of the HOTAS is almost 6 kilos. The throttle alone weighs in at just over 3 kilos. It's so heavy that in fact when you're not flying you could use it to safely tether the chain of your punishment midget in the back garden to allow him some fresh air and exercise. The throttle base is constructed from metal, while the throttles themselves are constructed from toughened plastic with metal handrests. All of the switches on the base of the throttle, with the exception of the flaps, are made from metal and require moderate force to operate. The buttons on the base of the throttle are plastic and also require moderate force to operate. The switches and hats on the right throttle are made from plastic and require minimal force to operate. The force required to operate the throttles themselves can be adjusted via the friction wheel. The overall build quality of the throttle is extremely impressive. Some people have complained about the force required to push buttons, but I see that as a positive for the following reason. Supposing you're just about to do a run-in on a target, but you have to take your hand away from the throttle for a split second to scratch an itchy taint. You accidentally flip the switch you've mapped to weapons jettison, and for the rest of the evening you have to listen to your squadron mates teasing you about eating crayons. This is not going to happen with the Warthog. There are two important considerations at work here. The switches on the base of the throttle require moderate force to prevent accidental operation, whereas the switches and hats on the throttle itself are linked to sensors and require only mild force to prevent accidental movement of the throttle during operation. Another ingenious feature of the throttle is the push-pull system, which operates in conjunction with the idle detent tabs. At this point it must be noted that with a small adjustment using a hex head, you can set whether the idle and afterburner detents operate or not. If you have the idle detent physically set, when you raise each throttle they activate hidden buttons. These buttons can be set to the idle detent in-game, which I think is an ingenious and immersive feature. The throttle is amazingly well built, however there are two issues in my book that keep it from being absolutely perfect. The first issue is with the trim wheel. I usually bind this to zoom in DCS and mixture in X-Plane. For the first year and a half this worked flawlessly, however over the last year or so I've noticed an annoying flaw creeping in. When set to the centre or either extremity it's fine, however when set anywhere in between that, the output tends to shimmer and wobble. I suspect this is the result of using a potentiometer rather than a Hall sensor, which is a little disappointing in a quality product. The only other issue with the throttle is the mouse hat or mini control stick. This is usually bound to TDC functions. To explain the issue to somebody who's never used it, I'm going to have to take you on a little journey. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of a stud farm. For those who are not, I will briefly explain it. A stud farm is a business which practices equine eugenics in exchange for astronomical profits. The goal of the business is to breed champion mares with champion stallions in order to produce more champions. Instead of incurring the stresses and costs with moving horses all over the world, the owner of the stud farm hires some absolute fucking deviants to wank the stallions off into a bag. The foal batter is then frozen and sold all over the world for astronomical amounts of shekels. The leftover jip is then sold to the nouveau riche as a health drink. If you could imagine there were butterfly stud farms, using all the same processes, I think you have some idea how annoying that fucking little stick is to use. The good news is there are aftermarket replacements available. While the aforementioned issues are annoying, they're not necessarily a deal breaker. The throttle is a formidable piece of hardware. The stick comes with a wide-weighted base, from which the pedestal can be detached for mounting to home cockpits or desk mounts. The stick itself is made from metal and as such is nice and heavy. I can't praise enough the level of control you feel when you're using this stick. It's absolutely exquisite. And the good news is, at least on my stick, it hasn't lost anything over the years. The other really cool feature of the stick is that there is no dead zone. It's sprung in such a way that you can move from any point to any other point through the centre without feeling any discernible stop. This allows for much more fluid control and eliminates the associated twitches you'll find with dead zones. The stick follows the same design philosophy as the throttle. So hats and countermeasure switches require light touch, whereas weapon switches require much more force. The metal 2-stage trigger has a nice solid pull which helps prevent accidental deployments.
Pull up! Pull up!
Moving on the subject of build and design, there is one last feature I want to cover. The gratitude for this particular feature is due more to Uncle Sam, but I think Thrustmaster deserved kudos for replicating it. You'll notice the hat, switches and buttons on the stick and throttle have different shapes and indentations. Obviously it eliminates the need to look every time you move your hand, and with the growing use of VR, it'll become an even more important feature. The penultimate area I'm going to cover is how well the hardware integrates with software. The Warthog does come with its own software for key binding and fiddling with the LEDs. It's called Target. However, every time I try to use software designed by hardware people, I'm reminded of the old saying, one should never hire a carpenter when one needs an obstetrician. The good news is that Thrustmaster Warthog works natively and flawlessly in every sim I've played. Before I wrap up, I'll just briefly and not inappropriately touch on price. Sim hardware can be relatively expensive, but the relationship between price and value for money is often quite subjective. For example, if you spend €250 Queen sheets on something and only use it for 1 hour a month over the space of 4 years, that's relatively poor value for money. However, if you use it every day for a couple of hours or every week for 5 or 6 hours, that's relatively good value for money. On the subject of price, if you don't have the available shekels, always check the various websites for sales. In addition, if you're not too fussy, check the reconditioned section of the Thrustmaster site. Now we've reached the point where I try to condense everything into a sentence or two. To sum up, the Warthog by Thrustmaster is an excellent HOTAS, with just a couple of annoying issues that sadly prevent it from being perfect. It connects via 2 USB ports, and setup in every sim I've tested has been smooth and intuitive. It's well built, ergonomic and extremely durable based on almost 3 years of extensive use. Personally, I would have no hesitation in recommending it to anyone who has more than a passing interest in either flight or space simming. All that's left to say is I thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to dislike or tell me to go fuck myself below.